So it's the early 1800s, and the Spanish Empire just went from basically being huge, spanning from Mexico in the north to the southernmost parts of South America, to being pretty small, consisting just of Puerto Rico and Cuba. All the rest was lost in the independence wars to these new countries. So at this point, Spain is really looking to hold on to Cuba. Cities like Havana had increased in size dramatically. In the recent decades, and especially over the first parts of the 19th century, largely based on sugar. And so Spain wanted to lock Cuba down. One of the people that Spain wanted to lock down was Father Felix Varela. Trained as a philosopher, he was adamantly opposed to slavery. He wanted a free Cuba, but he thought that a free Cuba, a Cuba free from Spain, also had to be a Cuba free from slavery. A slaveholding country can never be free. But unfortunately, Cuba was dependent on slavery. The island was unwilling to give up slavery. Felix Varela eventually fled to the U.S. Slavery in Cuba got someone else interested in the island, and that was the U.S. South. They were looking to expand, looking for new slave states to kind of balance power in the U.S. So this one individual, Narciso Lopez, a Spanish general born in Venezuela, went to the U.S. and tried to recruit an army. He basically put out ads in newspapers looking for soldiers to go and invade Cuba, to liberate Cuba, and probably to make it part of the U.S. They invaded Cardenas with several hundred men. They lost, they didn't win, but one thing that did come from his invasion was the Cuban flag. It was the first time it was flown. So it came from this kind of weird moment in history. Other U.S. presidents were interested in Cuba, not that Narciso Lopez was a president, but for example, James Buchanan at one point tried to buy Cuba from Spain, and he certainly wasn't the only one. By the 1860s, far more Cubans were interested in independence, interested in changing the system. But before that, they still were looking for ways to kind of stick with Spain, to stick with their heritage. And it seemed as though Spain was offering them kind of an olive branch. They invited some reformers to Spain to think up ideas for reform. Essentially, they took their ideas, listened to them, and then threw them in the garbage. Spain just was not willing to listen. And for many Cubans, the only thing left was war. And so Carlos Manuel de Cespedes, he kind of declares war against Spain, his grito de Yara, cry of Yara. He frees his enslaved people and begins the fight against Spain. This is the 10 Years' War. And the 10 Years' War, it's a long, drawn-out, back-and-forth series of battles between Cuba and Spain. Eventually, Cuba is going to lose, but during this war, some of our most important independence figures emerge. Maximo Gomez, for one, another Antonio Maceo, one of the most important generals in the Cuban Independence Wars. As well, his mom, Mariana Grajales, is part of the first stages of the war. So what comes next? After the 10 Years' War, many people were tired of fighting. Most generals signed the treaty to end the fighting. Antonio Maceo, he refused, as well as another general, Calixto Garcia. And they tried to continue the fighting in what is known as the Small War. Basically, the Cubans were tired. They fought for 10 years and lost, and they were not ready to go on. So Spain is back. Spain is really back in full control of the island from essentially about 1880 to 1894, when the fighting picks up again, and that's because of Jose Marti. He's able to kind of bring together all of these different forces inside the island, outside the island, for this final push towards freedom. Marti, of course, was a writer, an accomplished writer, a poet, journalist, travel writer, pretty much everything. So he was one side of this coin. People like Maceo, of course, were generals in this final stage as well, were the kind of other side of the coin. The Spanish, though, they used brutal tactics in this war. Concentration camps, burning rural areas, trying to destroy food supplies for the soldiers who were mainly using guerrilla warfare to combat the superior numbers of the Spanish. But on the sidelines, of course, this whole time, someone is watching closely. That is the United States. Amidst their watching, they send the U.S. Maine to the Cuban harbor, and the result there, eventually, the Maine is sunk. It was an accident. It was not the Spanish. However, this this event propels the United States into the war. Yellow journalism in the United States at this time does not help, but here the U.S. is in the war against Spain. It's not that the U.S. was wrong to enter the war against Spain to help Cuba. It's just that at this point the Cubans did not really need help from the U.S. Spain had essentially offered Cuba its almost independence, a sign that they were going to lose. Redfield Scott, a U.S. senator, went down to Cuba. Listen to his description of what he saw on the island.
I went to Cuba with a strong conviction that the picture had been overdrawn. What I saw I cannot tell so that others can see it. To me, the strongest appeal is not the loss of the man, but the spectacle of 1.5 million people struggling for deliverance from the worst government of which I ever had knowledge.
Spain was essentially putting the Cubans through hell, but as the U.S. entered to help Cuba, many people started to remember one of Jose Marti's quotes. Marti, having died a few years earlier, had warned heavily about U.S. involvement in the war, the idea that they would somehow replace Spain. It worried him, it concerned him as a threat to Cuba, as a threat to Cuba's true independence. After some brief fighting, Spain surrendered to the United States. Cuba's wars for independence were officially over. However, they did not even attend the negotiations to end the war. Those were held strictly between Spain and the United States, thus throwing into question this idea that the U.S. was there to help Cuba. Cuba did not attend the negotiations to end its own independence struggle. So what next for Cuba? Well, they're going to spend almost the next 4 years kind of under the control of the United States. In a period of military occupation, really, General Leonard Wood is the first one who kind of rules the island after Spain leaves. So it's still another several years before Cuba even gets any independence.